Hello, Anish.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh.
So we're here for a new episode of the Akal and Coca report. We're going to try something a little different today. Um, for what it's worth, I mean, people on podcasts, when this gets to be on podcast, I think should be able to follow. But since we have the video, we may as well take advantage of it. So I'm going to give you a talk. I haven't prepared in depth, so don't get your hopes too high. But let me share the screen here. So there's a paper that just came out, published online on JAMA, about shared medical decision making. And I want to slay that sacred cow, or that golden calf. What do you think?
Sounds good. I'm all yours to see see what you think about shared decision making.
All right. So the paper is here on screen. It's mandatory shared decision making by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the author is Faisal Merchant, who's a cardiologist apparently at Duke, an electrophysiologist. And I'm not going to discuss the paper in detail, but the gist is that Medicare is now going to mandate shared decision making, whatever that means, and we'll go into that in just a little bit. Before implantation of defibrillators, ICDs. And apparently, I didn't know that this is not the first time that CMS mandates shared decision making. They've mandated it so far for left atrial appendage closure and for screening for lung cancer with low dose CT. So this editorial announces that this is going to be rolled out, and the editorial in general is very supportive of these kinds of mandates because, as we will see, it may be particularly beneficial in case for which physicians have incentives to recommend costly treatment. And so I wanted to, share decision making. I mean, being against shared decision making right now is like being against, the flag and apple pie and mothers. You hear about shared decision making (SDM). Um, you know, you read about it on every other page of medical journals. It's unquestioned as being an unalloyed good that we should all follow. It should be the model for the doctor-patient relationship. And what's interesting is that I had never heard of the term when I was in medical school or training or fellowship, and it really emerged in full force just in a few years. So to get a sense of that, I went on PubMed and I did a search term, query for the search term shared decision making. And as you can see here, it was barely in the medical literature in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then it starts to rise, in the late 1990s. And then 2000, there's more. And then in the last 5 years, boom, it just explodes. Everything is about shared decision making all of a sudden. And, I thought that's a little strange. Why would that be? And what do people mean when they say shared decision making? What are your thoughts, Anish? What do you think when somebody says shared decision making? What does that mean to you?
I mean, as you've said, it came into vogue, the last 10 years or so that I've been hearing this more and more, and it seems to be something that's is about trying to align, the decisions that are being made with the patient's interest. I mean, the fundamental premise is that most of the decisions that are being made in somewhat of a paternalistic manner. Decisions are made mostly because the physicians shade patients to make one decision or the other, and the physician's point of view may be very different from what the physician wants is very different from what the patient wants. So I understand the basic premise is to try to align the decisions made with what the patient wants. So, the classic story is of the oncologist that is seeing a patient with pancreatic cancer that is end stage, and the oncologist wants to keep going, and maybe that's not what the patient and what the family want. And the idea is that has not, that has gone. Most treatment has gone the way that physicians want, not what patients want. So we
Yeah, I
have
think
a better path forward with shared decision making, apparently.
right. Right. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that's essentially the gist of it. Although we have something called informed consent, right? And then the question becomes, what is the relationship between informed consent and shared medical decision making? And that's essentially so. So I was curious, and I went back to try to see where this whole thing started, and I tried to find the first mentions of the term. And actually, in the 60s and 70s, it's in German speaking language. It has nothing to do with our current concept, but it begins in full force in 1980 or 1982. With a report. This is from 1982. It's a report called Making Healthcare Decisions, and it's a report issued by a presidential commission on medical ethics. And I don't know if you're aware. I wasn't aware of it until a few years ago. But since the 1970s, there have been periodically commissions, medical ethics or bioethics commissions, set up either by Congress or by the president or by the governments, one way or another, to study certain topics of importance. And that came about in the aftermath of the Tuskegee syphilis scandal. The Tuskegee syphilis study scandal, which at some point we should do a show about that. It's really if people don't know about it, it's a horrific event in public health. And but anyway, so there was this huge scandal, and so they got together a commission to study the question of the ethics of participation in research, in clinical research, and that gave rise to the establishment of IRBs, institutional review boards, and so forth. And since then, periodically, every few years, there's a presidential commission that gets together and addresses an important topic, and they can be very influential. They can, for example, there was one that I was interested in, was instrumental in legalizing the concept of brain death across the United States, and it also took place in the early 1980s. So this one was commissioned to study the question of informed consent, because at that time, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was a perceived crisis in medical malpractice. A lot of doctors and hospitals were getting sued. And it seemed that a lot of the times the claim was that the patients were not getting sufficient informed consent about the risk of procedures and so forth. And the courts dealt with that, frequently by, if they would side with the patient that indeed informed consent did not take place, and that it should take place. And as a result of these court decisions, the procedure of informed consent that we're all familiar with sort of came to be. So the reason why we now fill out forms, with fine print, and we ask the patient to sign the informed consent, has emerged from all these legal cases from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah. And it's amazing. I mean, since we started doing informed consent, we have ended medical malpractice. It's
exactly
the problem of medical malpractice.
Wonderful. Correct. Well, this commission was commissioned. This group of ethicists, and were commissioned. And these guys, who sits on those commissions? I really have no idea how they get selected. Some of them are MDs, some of them are non-MD ethicists, some of them represent different religious perspectives, and nothing wrong with that. I mean, I have no problem with this diversity, but I'm not exactly sure how that, how they get selected, but they do get selected. So they were selected and asked to study the question of informed consent and whether steps should be taken to improve on it. Because by that time, it was pretty well established that, doctors should have a discussion with the patient about the risks of a treatment or a procedure, and get them to document on a piece of paper that they're consenting to the treatment. And so they got together, and they had, this is not just a commission that meets, that met just once. they had 2 or 3 years before they were able to publish this report. And the report is really quite thick. It's like hundreds of pages with tons of citations. And they also had, they were able to commission 3 empirical studies while they were preparing the report, to survey patient preferences and patient views and perspectives on the whole process of informed consent and physician and all that stuff. So at any rate, it's a huge thing. It's not surprisingly, it's not that difficult to read. Some of these, huge reports that you read, like the ones that come out of the Institute of Medicine, for example, I mean, they're completely unreadable. But this one is actually quite readable. So it starts by giving the history of the process of the crisis of informed consent and the crisis of malpractice, and how the courts have responded to the crisis. And I want to read just the first paragraph just to set the tone here. It says, "The complexities of modern life make it difficult for individuals to be masters of their own fate. Perhaps in no sphere of everyday activity is this more acute than in healthcare. This often frustrating lack of control can be traced to several recent developments: the increasing reliance on advanced technology, the high degree of specialization, the consequent segmentation of care among an imposing array of healthcare professionals who are often strangers to the patient, etc." So all of this, sort of conspires to make it difficult for patients to, maintain their, a certain sense of control during the healthcare experience. And I think that's correct. There's nothing wrong with that. And then they go on to criticize the current system that has emerged from the courts and the laws. Current requirements for informed consent owe much to the legal system, but the values underlying these requirements are not merely legal artifacts. Rather, they are deeply embedded in American culture and the American character. They transcend partisan ideologies and the politics of the moment. Fundamentally, informed consent is based on respect for the individual, and in particular, for each individual's capacity and right, both to define his or her own goals and to make choices designed to achieve those goals. So what they're really pushing here is the doctrine of self-determination, or the doctrine of autonomy, that has become a very, very prominent ethical doctrine in modern medical ethics. And we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit later when we discuss. But that's the gist of what they're driving at. So self-determination, sometimes termed autonomy, is an individual's exercise of the capacity to form, revise, and pursue personal plans for life. And more is involved in respect for self-determination than just the belief that each person knows what's best for him or herself, however. Even if it could be shown that an expert or a computer could do the job better, the worth of the individual, as acknowledged in Western ethical traditions, and especially in Anglo-American law, provides an independent and more important ground for recognizing self-determination as a basic principle in human relations, particularly when matters as important as those raised by healthcare are at stake. So essentially, it's very important to pay attention to self-determination. Interestingly, it's a little bit confusing to me what they're driving at here. They say more is involved than just the belief that each person knows what's best for him or herself. And if it could be shown that an expert could do the job better, the worth of the individual, as acknowledged in Western, in white supremacist traditions, I might add, that was written, 30 years ago. I'm not sure if it would fly today, this kind of language, this allusion to Western ethical traditions and to the Anglo-American law. But there it is. I mean, that's really at the root of the shared medical decision-making process, is this nod to Western ethical tradition as a ground for recognizing self-determination as a basic principle in human relations. So that's, that's the background. So they go on, and here I skip a few pages. And then, the realities of court decisions on informed consent fall short. So here they're describing what we're up until now practicing. This process by which, before the procedure, we, give the patient 18 pages of fine print and say, here, go sign, and, and there you go. And then they say the commission, I mean, that's really the bottom line, while recognizing the difficulty of the task, believes that shared decision-making is the appropriate ideal for patient-professional relationships that a sound doctrine of informed consent should support. But believe it or not, nowhere in the whole document, the whole 300 pages, do they really define what shared decision making is about. I mean, they take it as granted or at face value that we'll understand what the concept is just from the compounding of the words, shared decision making. And as we will see perhaps later, I'll leave that for later. That can be a real problem. So what happens? So that's a big document that comes out in the 1980s, produced by ethicists, at the government level. And they say in the document, we don't think the law should be changed. We don't think that this process of shared decision making should come about by legal means. We need to change the culture of the medical profession, and we need to sensitize doctors to the idea of shared decision making. Okay, so that's in 1980. What happens next? For the next 20 years, nothing happens. 25 years, as I showed you on the graph, zero, zilch. I don't hear about it in medical school, in residency, in fellowship. I finished all my training in 2002. Nothing about shared decision making that I recall. But then it starts to emerge in 2000, or so. What do you think happened around that time?
2000.
2000. A couple of things. I mean, one is a movement that sort of grew that predates 2000, but sort of by 2000 it had really flourished. And we talked about that, quite a bit.
In 2000?
Previous episodes. Yeah, I mean, what's happened, by the late 1990s, it was the
healthcare and managed care?
Yeah, in medicine.
Oh, yeah, the growing
EBM.
Growing movement for... Oh, EBM used
evidence-based medicine. No, evidence-based medicine emerged. So now you have...
But EBM is... EBM has been around since Sackett when did Sackett first do his thing at McGill? It's been a long time prior to that.
The first papers from Sackett in JAMA was 1992.
1992.
So yes. I mean, the groundwork was laid out, but it really didn't take off until the 1990s. And by the late 1990s and 2000, then you have the multiplicity. So not only do you have the acceptance of EBM as the scientific way of practicing medicine, but you also have a bunch of clinical trials on the basis of which you can now actually have something to share with the patient. Because if you think about it, what are you going to share? Before in general, in the past, if in the past it was primarily your clinical experience.
Right.
You're going to tell the patient, well, on the basis of my clinical experience, you should get this treatment.
Right.
And then what is the patient going to say? No, I don't, on the basis of my, what do they have to come back? So essentially, EBM sort of, I think, in my mind at least, I mean, I don't think that's stated, but that's my observation, is that EBM gave shared medical decision-making sort of a second wind or some wings now to take off. And along with that, I think it's related to EBM, you have the Institute of Medicine launching of the quality and safety movement with, their documents, to err is human, these famous documents. So you have the launching of the quality movement, the error movement, and that whole,
I guess you're right. I kind of viewed it as all of this happening with the standardization of medicine.
That's right. Which I think
you're right in
that part of it.
You're right in that the standardization of medicine does coincide with with EBM. I mean,
right, because EBM essentially gives a method
basis for that.
Right, it gives a method to standardize things. So you have the emergence of EBM, and now you have a method to standardize things. And then what happens next is you have wait, I'm trying to click on the next slide here. What's happening? Page down. Well, whoops. Are you there?
Yep, I'm still there.
Okay, my screen disappeared. Okay. But yeah. So what is shared decision making nowadays in a technical sense? What is referred to is referred to as, okay, of course they want the doctor to sit with the patient and have a conversation. But the difference is that right now shared decision making is employing decision aids, right? And all this has emerged in the last 15 years. So you have the emergence of decision aids. You have these little. You're familiar with those little little gimmicks. The little apps with smiley faces and frowny faces. And you plug in the patient's characteristics, the age, the cholesterol level, and whatnot, and then it shows graphically to the patient exactly what the risks are of the treatment, of the procedure, what exactly.
Yeah.
It's
of course, the argument is that we are now making better decisions because of all this stuff.
Right, exactly, and
you would disagree,
but yes, I mean, there's no basis to that argument. It's a different conversation. I mean, it's part of the conversation. But on the one hand, we're supposed to be still to retain our autonomy as a physician, right? And our judgment. And on the other hand, we're supposed to take these decision aids into account. And so you look at this decision aid, and what are you supposed to conclude from that decision aid? Are you supposed to conclude that yes, you should treat, or no, you shouldn't treat? I mean, I'm not sure how that immediately gives rise to the right decision. And now, what if the patient looks at this decision aid and comes to a conclusion that you as a physician disagree with? And
well, I guess that's the point. The point is that to create some balance in terms of the information asymmetry that exists between patient and physician.
Yeah,
and this provides some balance and informs their decision. Do you? Yeah. So
that's right. I mean, I think it's all faulty. I don't have a time, but I don't think. If I think it's the right thing to do, I think a treatment is the right thing to do. Either I'm right or I'm wrong, but there's no proof that I'm right or wrong. Empirical proof.
But so Michel, here's the thing: you're a master. You're a clinician that listens to the patients. You've spent a lot of time with them. You parse whether or not this is an athlete who is running marathons and versus somebody who's sedentary. There's lots of
exactly. So meaning there are things that don't enter into the equation. That gives rise to this little graphic.
Well, what if you get it wrong? What if you as the clinician misread your patient?
What does that mean? I mean, misread in what way?
Meaning you think what you think you know what the best thing is for your patient, but say you're like you're some physician that has poor EQ and therefore
how do you prove that I got it wrong? Now suppose that I first of all, the decision aid is not supposed to tell you really how to treat, right? Now suppose I treat I give the drug or I do the procedure, and 6 months later the patient dies. Does that mean that was the wrong thing to do?
No, not necessarily.
Right.
It's hard to falsify probabilities.
Correct. So it doesn't mean that it was the right thing, or suppose the patient lives, does that mean that it was the right thing to do to give the treatment?
Right.
You don't know. I mean, it's completely, the uncertainty is not taken out of the equation. You're still living in a completely undetermined world.
So the point you're making is that this does not capture all the different data points that goes into making a decision, right?
Number one, and it essentially distorts a little bit what the decision-making process is.
So giving them a sense of, somebody like them, if they were started on a statin, whether, their chance of having a future heart attack or their chance of not having a heart attack, they know themselves the best. Can't they decide? what do they need us for? Why can't
exactly. I mean, I think that's the idea, right? Exactly. At that point, what do they need us for?
Yeah.
And so the main point now, I want to go back to what the commission was saying initially, and how it put this question of patient autonomy really as the pinnacle value that we should address. And that to me is a very false idea,
right?
Because it's really in the nature of being a patient that you lose. I mean, to be a patient means that you don't have full possession and full control of your capacities. I mean, that's what patient means. If you go to the etymology of patient is the opposite of agent, right? In Greek, agent and action, patient and passion. So a patient, it means that things happen to you and you're unable to act. And that's why they come to the doctor, and the doctor really has to be very careful and has to take his role primarily, and that's where Hippocrates was so important. I mean, we've completely lost sight of Hippocrates, but But in the Hippocratic ideal, is that you become, an advocate for the patient, and you take the interest of the patient at heart, and you essentially are acting as a surrogate for
Right.
the patient who is incapacitated.
Right. But in the
Level.
time
Now,
of
of course,
right.
it's easy to see when somebody is in a coma or has septic shock and whatnot. They can't make a decision.
Yeah.
But it's equally true when somebody comes and has to decide whether to take a statin or not. That really doesn't go away. It may be a little bit less intense, and maybe, I mean, there's room for discussion. I don't dispute that. I don't dispute the fact that somebody who comes and wants to have a question about primary prevention of disease, that pretty much they have full control, and they should be able to decide if they want their mammogram or not.
Right.
That is true. But if they're asking me for my opinion, that means that at some level they don't have full control, right? And therefore it's not a shared decision. It really is ultimately my decision on their behalf. Right. So the whole thing is false, and the whole thing continues to perpetuate this notion, which I think is wrong, and the whole of modern medicine is based on it, is that we as doctors are primarily technician. Right. So we have technical expertise and technical know-how. And then there's a patient who's autonomous, and we have to respect their autonomy. And somehow we have to make that work. But it's not really the nature of the medical relationship. And that's a view of medicine that continues to separate us from patient. Right. So while supposedly they're trying to give more dignity to the patient, which I'm all for. At the same time, they're distancing us, the patient, and they're poisoning our relationship to the patient.
The problem is, Michel, is that, I think the movement for SDM comes from, I don't want to keep beating around the bush. The movement for SDM comes from the less is more crowd, from this idea that we're doing too much.
That's right. So that brings us to the current paper.
Yes.
So now you have the emergence of EBM, you have the quality and the safety movement, and then they start testing these decision-making aids. Right? They actually put them to the test. They actually have trials where they have a group that is subjected to SDM to the SDM decision aids, and lo and behold, wow. The ones that are subjected to these decision aids, they end up, using less, right? Using less healthcare, which of course I'm fully aware that there's an overutilization of healthcare. I don't dispute that. But now all of a sudden, SDM becomes, it's like, okay, autonomy is a goal, but really the main goal here is to reduce cost, and it becomes the tool for the policymaker, which is what this paper, in JAMA is all about. It's about, it's about reducing costs.
Right.
If we tell patients, here, look at the numbers, look at the number of frowny faces and so forth. They're going to opt for not getting the ICD, and it's all going to be
right. So I think what's happening is, again, there's a lot of beating around the bush when you say this.
It's good because the bush is worth beating very hard, because it's a huge bush.
Essentially, what a lot of folks think is that the vast majority of doctors are not fully informing patients about the actual facts. And all of this is to try to get them, forced decision aids is to get them to share with them the actual facts. So, and again, there are egregious examples among us, right? There are people that have 6 months to live who get ICDs. Clearly have 6 months to live, they get ICDs. There are folks that are on their 4th or 5th line of therapy, are having terrible side effects, and they oncologists, keep persisting. I mean, there's egregious examples among us that that all of us, unfortunately have heard about or know about. And so I think all of this is designed to give those patients that are captivated by this group of folks some aid in terms of not just going along with what they're saying.
So it's essentially a collective punishment for the other doctors that perhaps do talk to their patients and take to undergo a certain procedure. And so, do you think that procedure will work? I mean, does it really? Is it really? I mean, the people who are, let's say there are profiteers or people who really are pretty callous about their patients. Do you think that's really, they're not going to be able to overcome this little exercise?
I think
the patient, the decision aids thing.
Exactly. I think that is the great point. I think that's the great point that I think it would be better if we all spoke more plainer. And I think we should go after folks that are egregious and are so callous, as you're saying, with patients, instead of doing all the stuff that I don't think is going to really be worthwhile. And it's kind of hypocritical, right? Because whenever you have cases where if you do share decisions, so we had this case recently of the 105-year-old who came in with a stroke, who may get the question was, should he get a thrombectomy or not? And if you share the decision with the patient and the family to say that if the stroke completes, he will be in a very bad way, but if we do this procedure, even though if there's a 1 in 100 chance that it succeeds, we may avert the stroke completely. If the patient and the family choose the procedure, right, given what they know, given what has been told to them, they will, that is bad. That is not shared decision. Then we don't care about shared decision making. Then we don't care about patient autonomy. If the patient makes the wrong, my problem with a lot of this is that if the patient doesn't make the decision that a certain group of folks want them to make, then it's like, obviously we didn't tell them about the harms well enough.
That's right.
So,
that's right. Yeah, exactly. Because it all assumes that, it's false at so many different levels, but sort of deep philosophically, it's the wrong representation of how people make decisions. Number two, whether decisions can be shared, because really, no matter what, you can always influence the patient.
Right.
And if you really respect their autonomy and give them a little diagram and say, okay, you choose, and then they give you the wrong answer, as you said, we're going to say, we're going to shuck the diagram pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And but the biggest problem for me is that it further undermines the relationship between doctor and patients.
Yep. Well, in the end of the day, we are going to be replaced. This is why, providers, not physicians.
Correct.
We're going to be replaced by folks. This is how AI will replace us, because we will dumb down medicine to this point, and then we will be able to be replaced by AI, by Watson. So
that's right. So I mean, that's my little spiel on SDM.
No, it's great. It's great points. I think I don't know what the best solution is to deal with folks that that are unfortunately under the sway of physicians that perhaps have motives that aren't aligned with patients. You want to believe that most physicians have motives aligned with patients. We, of course, Michelle, you would agree, we have a system where a lot of times patients and physicians aren't necessarily aligned. So it's not surprising that there are physicians that are running around that are
correct
doing things. And I don't know what, I think the overall solution is to figure out how to align those incentives, and things we've talked about with Dr. Keith Smith from the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, where there's a broader systemic solution to this that would align patients, physicians and incentives. And we don't have that now. And then we have all these silly little band-aids that are unlikely to help, and certainly
are likely to harm, in my opinion. They're likely to further undermine the.
No, but that was a great review. I did not know about the history of SDM.
It's always very instructive. I mean, I do it, quite frequently when something doesn't sound right. Go back, and now you can get from PubMed. You get this graph immediately.
That's beautiful.
If you notice it, you notice it in the when you do a search term, immediately in the upper right hand corner. You get a graph of.
I'm curious to see what the graph of how often coca and achad were searched. I'm curious to see what that graph looks like.
It's going to go through the roof. So let me make an announcement to the audience that I'm hoping that within 2 weeks or 3 weeks we'll have a podcast feed as well, and that they can subscribe to. And but in the meantime, they can subscribe to this YouTube channel if they like to watch it on video. We'll continue to have both, and we have a lineup of great guests for the next few weeks. So once a week, the Akkad and Coca report will continue to to try to make sense of healthcare and medicine, and so I'm urging people to continue to subscribe to the show.
Yeah, should be fun, very exciting.
All right, Anish, nice chatting. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.